I sentenced a man to 14 days of labor detail at 9:41 in the morning, and by 9:43, the eastern wall of the Crittenden County safe zone ceased to exist. I need you to understand the sequence precisely, because the order is the only thing I've turned over, is more than the decision itself. Marcus Bell stood in front of my bench, a folding table with a salvaged nameplate reading Honorable Diane Okafor Watts. And I told him 14 days on the trench crew for stealing a can of pears from the communal pantry. He looked at me the way most of them looked at me by then. Not with anger, not with fear, but with the particular exhaustion of a person watching someone perform a job that no longer existed. I had seen that look on 60 faces over the previous 4 months. I had learned to read it as confirmation that the performance was necessary. Marcus opened his mouth to respond. The sound came first. Not an explosion. That would have been easier to process. It was a wet, collective percussion, like 1,000 sandbags dropped simultaneously from a height. Then the screaming started from the east, layered and directional, moving west toward us faster than anyone on foot should have been able to carry it. Deputy Erin Colquitt was already at the courthouse window. She had served as my bailiff since week 3, when we'd established the tribunal system that Governor Price's Safe Zone Charter authorized me to run. Erin was 26 and had the supernatural calm of someone who had stopped being surprised by catastrophe approximately 3 catastrophes ago. "The barricades down," she said. "The whole east section. They're already inside the market." I was still holding the gavel. I'd carved it myself from a broken chair leg because the symbolism mattered. Because I believed, still believe, in a way that I can no longer defend, but also cannot abandon. That the visible architecture of process is what separates governance from management. I held that gavel, and I looked at Marcus Bell, whose sentence I had just pronounced. And I watched the math change on his face before it changed on mine. "How many?" I asked Erin. "I can't count them. Hundreds, maybe more. The trench crew is gone." The trench crew. The 14 days of labor I had just assigned Marcus Bell to. The sentence I had delivered 40 seconds ago would have killed him in about 6 hours. Marcus looked at me. I looked at Marcus. Neither of us said it. "We need to move to the basement," Erin said. "Now, the charter evac protocol." "The charter evac protocol routes us to the school gymnasium," I said, "which is east. Then we go down." I knew what was beneath the courthouse. Everyone in the administrative tier knew. Governor Price had briefed us in week 1. A Cold War-era continuity of government facility, sealed since 1967, accessible through a hatch in the basement mechanical room. Price had called it the insurance policy. He'd also called it his, specifically, which I noted at the time but did not challenge because the zone was 7 days old, and I was still assembling the procedural framework that would allow me to challenge anything through channels that meant something. Price was not in the courthouse. Price was at the command post near the east barricade, which Erin had just told me no longer existed. I put the gavel in my jacket pocket. I have not taken it out since. "Everyone in this building, downstairs now," I said. "Erin, who's in the building?" She counted without looking. "You, me, Thomas from the clerk's office, Mrs. Gaines waiting for her custody mediation, her 2 kids, and him." She pointed at Marcus. 7 people. The courtroom had held 30 during the morning session 2 hours earlier, but I'd cleared the docket early because the Gaines mediation was sensitive and I didn't want an audience. Marcus Bell, the man I'd been sentencing, the man whose stolen pear had seemed important enough to formalize into a judgment, walked to the courtroom door before I did and held it open. Not for me. For Mrs. Gaines, who was already carrying her 4-year-old and pulling her 7-year-old by the hand. We went down. The basement mechanical room smelled the way all institutional basements smell. standing water, mineral dust, and the particular mildew of concrete that is never fully cured. Tomas Reyes found the hatch before I did. He'd been the county clerk's records assistant for 11 years before the outbreak and had once filed a facilities request to repair a steam pipe that ran directly over it. He knew the room's geography the way I knew the tribunal charter, not from authority, but from paperwork. The hatch was a steel circle set into the floor, 32 inches in diameter, painted over so many times, the handle was barely distinguishable from the surface. A faded radiation trefoil marked its center. Tomas grabbed the handle with both hands and pulled. Nothing moved. "It's been sealed since the 60s, he said. "Might be rusted shut." Above us, the sounds had entered the building. Not the screaming anymore. The screaming had stopped, which was worse. What replaced it was the shuffling, arrhythmic percussion of bodies moving through a space built for foot traffic, but not for this kind of foot traffic. Hundreds of them, pushing through the courthouse's first-floor entrance, drawn by the same geometry that funnels everyone toward government buildings during a crisis. The infected don't navigate, but they follow the grooves worn into the world by people who did. Marcus Bell stepped forward, knelt beside Thomas, and examined the hatch edge. He ran his finger along the seal. "Paint's the problem, not rust. Anybody got a knife?" Erin handed him her utility blade without hesitation. I watched a woman who'd served as my officer of the court hand a blade to a man I'd convicted 4 minutes ago, and felt nothing except the pragmatic awareness that he was right about the paint. Marcus scored the seal in a continuous line, working with a precision that suggested either patience or practice. Later, I learned he'd been a welder before the outbreak. Not a tradesman exactly, but a man who'd spent 11 years joining and cutting metal in a fabrication shop outside West Memphis, which meant he understood how sealed things opened and what it cost to open them incorrectly. "Got it." He pulled the handle. The hatch swung upward on hinges that screamed, and a column of air rose from below, cold, chemical, and sealed for 59 years. It smelled like time stopped in a jar. A steel ladder descended into darkness. 8 feet, maybe 10. The beam from Erin's flashlight revealed a concrete floor, a corridor, and nothing alive. "Mrs. Gaines, you and the kids first," I said. Sandra Gaines did not argue. She handed her 4-year-old B to Erin, lowered herself onto the ladder, and descended with the competence of someone who had spent 4 months climbing into and out of things not designed for climbing into and out of. Her 7-year-old, Jerome, followed without being told. He had not spoken since we left the courtroom. He had not spoken during the courtroom session either. Sandra had mentioned in her mediation filing that Jerome had stopped speaking on day 41. She had not explained what happened on day 41. Tomas went next. Then Erin lowered B to Sandra's raised arms and followed. Marcus looked at me. He gestured toward the hatch with a formality so precise it could only have been mockery or deference. And I could not tell which, and I still cannot. I descended. Marcus came last. He pulled the hatch shut above him, and the boom of its sealing resonated through the corridor with a finality I have spent every day since trying to locate the correct word for. It wasn't safety. It was subtraction. Everything above that hatch. The tribunal, the charter, the safe zone. The 4 months of procedural architecture I'd built with my voice and a carved gavel was now on the other side of 8 inches of Cold War steel, being consumed by the thing the architecture was supposed to have made unnecessary. We stood at the bottom in Erin's flashlight beam. 7 people, 2 of them children, 1 of them a man I had sentenced, all of them looking at me, because I was the judge. The facility was larger than Price had described, which made sense once I understood that Price had described it from a briefing document rather than from personal inspection. He'd known there was a hatch because someone had told him there was a hatch, the same way he'd known there was a pandemic because someone had told him there was a pandemic. Price governed from summaries. I'd built my tribunal around that understanding, filling the gap between his announcements and the reality that they floated above. The corridor ran 40 feet south from the ladder shaft and opened into a rectangular operations room approximately 30 by 50 feet. Two smaller rooms branched east, a communications alcove with equipment I couldn't identify, and a bunk room with 8 steel-frame cots, each made with military corners and wool blankets that crumbled slightly when Thomas touched one. A third door, west, opened into a storage room stacked with olive drab cases. Everything was labeled. The federal government of 1967 had believed in labels. Water purification tablets. Rations, field individual, case of 48. Medical kit standard shelter use, radio emergency, Conrad compatible. Blankets, wool, OD. Generator, gasoline, portable, gasoline, 5-gallon cans. Thomas inventoried the storage room, while Aaron secured the corridor. Sandra settled both children onto a cot in the bunk room, where B fell asleep inside 3 minutes with the absolute commitment of a 4-year-old who has learned that sleep is the most reliable exit from any situation. Jerome sat beside his sister and watched us through the open doorway with an attention that made me feel observed rather than seen. Marcus Bell stood in the operations room and turned in a slow circle, reading the labels. He stopped at a wall-mounted diagram, a cross-section schematic of the facility, laminated and bolted to the concrete. "Judge," he said. It was the first time he'd addressed me directly since the courtroom. I walked over. The schematic showed the facility's layout, the operations room where we stood, the 2 side rooms, the storage area, and, extending south beyond a sealed pressure door I hadn't yet noticed, a second corridor leading to a ventilation shaft with surface access approximately 200 feet south of the courthouse. "Second way out," Marcus said. "Or a second way in. Both of those things are useful to know." He was right. The sentence structure should not have surprised me. Marcus Bell spoke in complete, balanced clauses with a precision that would have been unremarkable in a courtroom, but was conspicuous in a man I'd processed as a pantry thief. But it did. I had read his intake file. I had read every intake file. His listed former occupation as welder, his education as HS diploma, his zone assignment as Labor Pool 3. None of these details suggested what I was beginning to see, which was that Marcus Bell was a person who thought in complete structures. I am documenting my own bias, because the bias is relevant to what happened next. "We need to verify that pressure door is sealed," I said. "Then we need to assess air quality, then provisions, then communication options." I delivered this in the voice I used for procedural rulings. Steady, sequential, authoritative. The voice that had maintained order through 4 months of disputes over food, space, custody, labor obligations, and the increasingly theological question of whether Price's charter constituted law or suggestion. "Makes sense," Marcus said. He did not add "Your Honor." He did not add anything. He simply confirmed the logic and moved toward the pressure door. Aaron caught my arm as I turned to follow. "Diane, you just sentenced that man." "I know." "So what is he now?" I did not answer, because I did not have a procedural framework for the question. Marcus Bell had been convicted under the tribunal charter of the Crittenden County Safe Zone. The Crittenden County Safe Zone was based on available evidence, being consumed above our heads. The charter derived its authority from Governor Price's emergency declaration. Governor Price was, based on available evidence, dead. Marcus Bell's sentence existed in a legal architecture that might have ceased to exist 6 minutes ago, and I had no mechanism for what to do with that. We secured the pressure door. Marcus examined its mechanism, a wheel lock system similar to a submarine hatch, and confirmed it was sealed from our side. Air entered the facility through 2 passive vents in the operations room ceiling, each fitted with a hand-cranked fan and a charcoal filter that Tomas identified as probably functional based on nothing more than the fact that it hadn't disintegrated. We cranked both fans. The air improved marginally, replacing the chemical stillness with something that approximated breathable. Tomas finished his inventory by flashlight and delivered it in the clipped, organized manner of a man who had spent 11 years filing documents by category. We had water purification tablets sufficient for 7 people for approximately 40 days, assuming the tablets still worked. Rations for roughly 30 days, assuming the freeze-dried components were still edible after 6 decades. 6 cans of gasoline for a generator we hadn't tested. Medical supplies of uncertain viability. A radio that required power we hadn't yet established. Wool blankets enough for 3 per person. 30 days of food, Sandra said from the bunkroom doorway. She'd been listening. She held B on her hip and spoke with the flat practicality of a woman who had been calculating food for 3 since the world contracted. That's if everything in those cans is still good, which it probably isn't. Some of it will be, Tomas said. The tablets especially. They're chemical, not organic. The rations. Maybe 70% viable if the packaging held. 21 days then, Sandra said. She was right. She was also the person in the room with the most immediate experience converting ration supplies into survival for dependents. Her mediation filing. The custody dispute I'd been about to hear when the wall came down had detailed 4 months of shared parenting inside a 6 by 10 foot zone allocation, managing caloric intake for 2 children with competing nutritional needs. I had read that filing as a legal document. I was beginning to read it as a resume. The generator started on the 3rd pull. Marcus primed it, adjusted the choke, and coaxed it into a rhythm that sounded irregular but sustained. Aaron connected it to the facility's internal wiring panel, which someone in 1967 had designed for exactly this sequence. And the overhead fluorescents flickered alive. In stages of first the operations room, then the corridor, then the bunk room. Light changed everything. Not the tactical situation. The tactical situation was the same. But the psychological register. Under flashlight, we'd been refugees in a hole. Under fluorescence, we were people in a room. Jerome looked up when the light entered the bunk room, and for a moment his expression shifted from watchful to something I'd call curious. Though I'm cautious about reading children's faces because I've been wrong about it before, including in my own courtroom, including about this specific child. Radio, Marcus said, pointing to the communications alcove. Aaron examined the equipment. The primary unit was a Conelrad-era receiver, useless for our purposes. But beside it sat a more recent addition, a VHF transceiver that someone had installed and wired into the shelter's electrical system, probably during a retrofit that the faded installation sticker dated to 1983. Aaron turned it on. Static filled the alcove, dense and layered. "This might reach someone," she said. "Depends on the antenna. If there's a surface antenna connected to this, maybe a few miles. If it's just the shelter's internal wiring acting as a conductor, maybe a few hundred feet of nothing." "Try it," I said. "What's our identifier?" She was asking me what to call ourselves. 7 people under a courthouse, with no government above them, broadcasting into a landscape we couldn't see. "Crittenden County Courthouse, emergency shelter," I said. "Not the tribunal?" It was not a challenge. Erin Colquitt did not challenge me. She clarified. She'd done it in the courtroom, and she did it here with the same professional neutrality that made her invaluable and occasionally infuriating. She wanted to know whether we were announcing ourselves as a legal body or a collection of survivors. I hesitated. Marcus was watching. Sandra was watching. Jerome was watching, silent, from the bunkroom doorway. "Courthouse shelter," I said. "Emergency basis. 7 souls." No one answered that first broadcast, or the second, or the 9 that followed over the next 3 hours. Aaron cycled frequencies with systematic patience, while the rest of us organized the facility into something livable. Tomas categorized the rations by estimated viability, discarding packages that had swollen or discolored. Sandra established the bunkroom as the children's zone, with a territorial efficiency I recognized from her mediation filings. This was a woman who understood that space is governance in miniature, and that who sleeps where determines who decides what. Marcus tested the pressure door's wheel lock 3 times, checking its seal from different rotational positions. He did this without being asked. He did most things without being asked, which I noticed because I was accustomed to assigning tasks and monitoring compliance. The tribunal had operated on explicit delegation, not voluntarism. Marcus Bell operated as if the structure of what needed doing was self-evident and external instruction was ornamental. I should describe the specific problem this created for me, because the problem is the fulcrum of everything that followed. For 4 months, I had maintained order in the Crittenden County safe zone through procedure, not through force. Aaron and the small security detail Price assigned me controlled force, and not through charisma, which I lack in distrust. Through procedure. Filings, hearings, rulings, sentences. The visible, repetitive, predictable machinery of adjudication. People brought disputes to me because the process existed, and the process existed because I performed it daily with the consistency of liturgy. I believed this. I still believe parts of it. The gavel in my pocket was carved from a chair leg because the object mattered less than the practice of lifting and lowering it. Underground, the procedure had no substrate. There was no charter, there was no governor, there was no zone. There were 7 people in a concrete room, and I was one of them. And the only thing distinguishing me from the others was a title that referenced an institution I could hear being destroyed. Through the ventilation system if I stood directly beneath the intake fan, which I did once for 11 seconds, before Aaron told me to stop. The question Aaron had asked me, what is he now? Metastasized through the first afternoon into a larger question she never explicitly posed, but that saturated every interaction. What are you now? I responded the way I respond to most existential provocations. I created a docket. I found a legal pad in one of the olive drab cases. The 1967 planners had included stationery, presumably for the continuity officials to draft post-nuclear memoranda. And I began recording. Date, names, ages, skills, medical conditions, resource inventory, air quality notes, decisions made and by whom. Tomas saw me writing and brought me the intake files he'd grabbed from the clerk's office when we evacuated. He'd stuffed 7 folders into his shirt, the active cases on my docket that morning, and carried them underground. Not because anyone asked, because he was a records clerk, and records clerks carry records, even into holes. Among those 7 folders was Marcus Bell's. I opened it that evening while the others slept, or approximated sleep, which is what you do on a 60-year-old military cot in a room humming with a generator that sounds like it's deciding whether to continue. Marcus's file contained his intake questionnaire, his labor assignment, his infraction report for the stolen pair, and my own sentencing memorandum, handwritten the previous night. The sentencing memorandum read, Respondent Bell, Marcus T. Infraction, unauthorized taking of communal provisions. 1 compares, Del Monte, 15 ounces. Sentence: 14 days labor detail, trench maintenance crew. Rationale: deterrent. Bell shows no remorse and offered no defense. Pattern indicates disregard for communal structure. I read the words, shows no remorse and offered no defense, and for the first time heard them differently, not as judicial observation. As a description of a man who did not recognize the authority pronouncing judgment on him, and considered engagement a concession he was unwilling to make. I closed the file. I did not sleep. On the second morning, Marcus Bell held a hearing. He didn't call it that. He didn't call it anything. He simply sat down at the operations room table at what I estimated to be 7 a.m. We had no working clock, and the fluorescent light emitted no diurnal rhythm, and said, we should figure out water. The water purification tablets could treat water we didn't have. The facility's original design assumed a municipal water connection that Tomas located in the wall. A capped pipe with a valve handle, but turning it produced nothing. The system above us had either been disconnected or the municipal supply had failed, which was likely given that the zone's water treatment had depended on a generator-powered pump that was now presumably unmanned. There's condensation on the vent ducts, Sandra said. Not much, but it's collectible. How much? Marcus asked. Depends on temperature differential. Maybe a liter a day across both vents. Not enough for 7. Enough for 2 kids, Marcus said. Sandra looked at him. The look contained a calculation I couldn't read. Not gratitude, not suspicion, but an assessment of whether the statement was genuine or strategic. She'd spent 4 months inside a safe zone where every allocation carried a political subtext, where the men who offered extra portions to mothers always wanted something later. We need to access the second exit, Marcus said. The ventilation shaft to the south. If we can reach the surface safely, we can collect rainwater. There's catchment potential in the courthouse parking structure. If the surface is clear, Aaron said. If, Marcus agreed. The pressure door opens from this side only, Tomas added. If someone goes through and can't come back, someone goes through with a radio, Marcus said. We've got the VHF and we've got Aaron's handheld. One stays here, one goes through. Constant contact. They were building a plan. I was watching a plan get built at a table where I sat without having been consulted. The logic was sound. Every element was reasonable. Marcus ran the conversation not by asserting authority, but by asking questions whose answers assembled themselves into a sequence that everyone could follow. He facilitated. He didn't command. This is the specific judicial term for what I recognized. He was conducting a proceeding. I'll go through the pressure door, Marcus said. I can handle the hardware if anything needs cutting or welding on the other side. Aaron stays on radio. Tomas monitors the generator. Sandra manages the kids and the rations. He had assigned everyone a role. Everyone except me. Judge Okafor Watts monitors the intake fan for sound changes, he added, almost gently. If the infected clear out above us, we'll hear the difference. He'd given me the ceiling, the act of listening for what was above us and interpreting its meaning. It was, I understood immediately, both a genuine tactical function and a precise metaphor for what he thought my role should be, listening and interpreting, not directing. Aaron looked at me, not for permission, for my reaction. That's a reasonable plan, I said. The words cost me something I couldn't price. Marcus nodded, rose, and walked toward the pressure door. Aaron handed him her handheld radio. Sandra retreated to the bunk room. Tomas checked the generator's fuel level. I sat at the table, the legal pad in front of me, and recorded the decision. Day 2. 700 estimated. Decision: exploratory sortie through pressure door to ventilation shaft, proposed by M. Bell. Approved by consensus. Assignments as noted. J. Okafor Watts. Acoustic monitoring. I wrote approved by consensus and stared at the phrase. In the tribunal, consensus was not a recognized mechanism. Decisions derived from a charter, interpreted by a judge, enforced by delegated authority. Consensus was the thing the tribunal existed to replace the mob arithmetic of who agrees with whom, with the structured, insulated logic of law, applied by a person trained to resist exactly the social pressures that consensus amplifies. Underground, in a room with no charter, consensus had just assigned me to listen to a ceiling. I listened to the ceiling. Marcus returned through the pressure door 90 minutes later, carrying 4 gallons of rainwaters in containers he'd fabricated from debris. The ventilation shaft opened into a utility corridor beneath the courthouse's south parking structure, which was empty of infected and partially shielded by a collapsed section of the building above. He'd found a gap in the rubble large enough to access the exterior surface, where a rainstorm had pooled water in a drainage basin. He'd also found 11 people. They came through the pressure door in a line, blinking in the fluorescent light, carrying injuries and children and the compressed, flat-eyed expression I'd seen on every new arrival to the safe zone. Except these weren't arriving to a safe zone. They were arriving to a government fallout shelter occupied by 7 people who had not invited them and had no infrastructure to support them. Marcus introduced them by name. He'd learned their names in the 90 minutes he'd been gone. A family of 4. David and Angela Park and their teenage sons, Jin and Samuel. A woman named Ruthie Summer, who walked with a limp and carried a medical bag she identified as a nursing kit. A man named Curtis, who gave no last name and answered questions in single syllables. A couple, both silent, who held hands and let David Park speak for them. I later learned their names were Omar and Nadia, and that they had not been a couple before the outbreak, but had become one, through the specific mathematics of shared hiding. And a man alone, middle-aged, whose name was Leonard Fisk and whose first words upon entering the operations room were, "Who's in charge here?" He was looking at me when he said it, not at Marcus, who had led them in, not at Erin, who stood by the radio with her hand near her sidearm. At me. I was seated at the table with the legal pad, and something about the configuration, the table, the writing, the posture, broadcast what I was before anyone said it. "I'm Judge Okafor Watts," I said. "Crittenden County District Court." "District Court," Leonard repeated. The way he said it carried the weight of a man who knew what district courts were and had opinions about them. "Is this an official facility?" "It's a federal continuity shelter beneath a county courthouse, currently occupied on an emergency basis." "Under whose authority?" Erin shifted. Marcus, who was distributing water to the new arrivals, paused. "Mine," I said. I said it before I decided to say it. The word came from the same mechanism that had produced 4 months of rulings, the trained, automatic assertion of jurisdiction when jurisdiction is questioned. I claimed authority the way a reflex closes a hand around a railing, not because you chose to, but because falling is worse. Leonard Fisk nodded slowly. He was assessing. I would learn over the following days that Leonard had been a county administrator in Woodruff County before the outbreak, a bureaucrat of modest rank and considerable procedural knowledge who had survived by attaching himself to systems. He recognized institutional language the way Thomas recognized filing systems. As native terrain. "Then I'd like to file a complaint," Leonard said. "Against whom?" "The man who brought us here." He pointed at Marcus. He didn't tell us the shelter had limited provisions before he invited us in. We have a right to know what we're walking into. The room contracted. Sandra appeared in the bunkroom doorway. Tomas stopped sorting rations. Marcus stood holding an empty water jug and watched Leonard with an expression I'd seen in my courtroom before. The particular stillness of a person deciding whether the system in front of them is worth engaging with. "We'll address resource allocation collectively," I said. "But this isn't a courtroom, and I'm not taking filings." "You just said you were the authority." "I said this is an emergency occupation." "You said mine." He was right. I had said it. And the 6 people who'd been down here since the beginning had heard me say it. And the 11 people who'd just arrived had heard me say it. And Marcus Bell, the man whose sentence I'd never formally vacated, had heard me say it. I'd claimed the gavel again. Now I had to decide if I'd meant it. I meant it. I decided this in the 20 seconds following Leonard's challenge, not through philosophical reflection, but through the immediate tactical recognition that 18 people in an enclosed space, with diminishing provisions and no external governance, would self-organize around something, and I preferred that something be a person trained in procedural discipline, rather than whoever was loudest or most physically imposing. This is not a noble motive. I'm telling you what it was. I established what I called protocols. Not a charter. I'd watched Price's charter fail to survive contact with the first real crisis above ground, and the word itself had soured. Protocols. A shift schedule for the generator. Water collection rotations through the ventilation shaft. Ration allocations managed by Sandra, who understood the work and had already begun doing it. Medical triage by Ruthie, who inventoried the 1967 medical kit with the weary competence of a nurse who'd been improvising with expired supplies since the outbreak began. I assigned Marcus Bell to infrastructure. The pressure door, the ventilation shaft, the generator, any mechanical problem that arose. This was not a sentence. It was a role assignment. I made the distinction verbally when I announced it, and Marcus acknowledged it with a nod that conveyed neither acceptance nor resistance, but something more unsettling. Indifference to the category I was placing it in. Leonard Fisk I assigned to census and documentation, which served 2 functions. It utilized his administrative competence, and it kept him occupied with process rather than politics. He accepted with a visible satisfaction. A man who is counting is a man who is not contesting. For 3 days, the protocols held. People followed them because the alternative was visible. 18 people. In a sealed space without structure is not an abstraction. It is a smell, a sound level, a conflict frequency that escalates geometrically. The protocols reduced friction. They gave people scheduled purposes. They distributed the burden of uncertainty into manageable administrative units. On the evening of day 3, Aaron made contact on the VHF. The voice was military, clipped, professional, transmitting from a mobile unit identifying itself as a National Guard logistics element operating in the region. They wanted our location, our head count, our medical status, and our resource level. Aaron provided everything. The voice said they'd relay our position to a regional coordination center. No extraction timeline, no promises, just acknowledgement that we existed in their system. I should have felt relief. What I felt was a thread of anxiety so specific I can still trace its origin. The military voice had asked for our head count, our resources, and our location. It had not asked who was in charge. Nobody external had validated my authority. Nobody external had needed to until now, because the shelter had been sealed and self-referential. But the moment we made contact with an outside institution, the question of who we were, legally organizationally, jurisdictionally, became a question someone else might answer differently. That night, Marcus sat in the operations room, cleaning the generator's air filter with a strip of wool blanket. I was updating the legal pad. We were alone. Aaron was sleeping. Sandra was with the children. Leonard was conducting his census in the storage room, which he had converted into a private office with the bureaucratic instinct of a man who understands that controlling information begins with controlling its physical location. "You know he's going to challenge you," Marcus said. "Leonard. He's been counting heads and rations since he got here. When his numbers tell a story he likes better than yours, he'll tell it. That's his right." Marcus looked at me with the expression I'd first seen in the courtroom. Not anger, not contempt, but the exhaustion of watching performance. "You keep saying words like right, like the word still loads the same." "It does. It loads different down here, and you know it." He returned to cleaning the air filter. I returned to the legal pad. The exchange had lasted 30 seconds. It dismantled something in me that took 6 more days to become visible. Leonard Fisk's census was thorough. He presented it on day 5, standing at the operations room table with 3 pages of handwritten notes, having requested what he called a community meeting to address resource sustainability. I allowed it, because refusing a meeting to discuss provisions would have cost more authority than granting one. His numbers were precise: 18 people, 11 adults, 2 teenagers, 3 children. He counted Jerome and Jin Park's 14-year-old brother Samuel as children, which I would have contested but did not because the definitional argument would have consumed the meeting. Rations at current distribution would last 14 days. Water collection provided roughly 60% of daily need, supplemented by the purification tablets treating collected rainwater. The generator had fuel for 9 days at current usage. Medical supplies were limited to wound care and a deteriorating stock of expired antibiotics. "These numbers describe a system in decline," Leonard said. "Not a crisis, a decline, which means decisions made now determine whether the decline is managed or catastrophic." He was right. His numbers were accurate, and his framing was sound. I knew this because I'd run the same calculations privately on day 2 and arrived at the same conclusions. "What are you proposing?" I asked. "A rationing committee, elected, 3 members, decisions by majority, transparent allocation based on caloric need and physical output." "We have a rationing system," I said. "Sandra manages distribution." "Sandra was assigned by you. I'm proposing she be confirmed by vote, along with 2 other members selected by the group." The room was watching. Every person in the shelter was present. Leonard had timed his meeting for the shift changeover when all adults were awake. Marcus leaned against the far wall. Sandra stood in the bunk room doorway with B on her hip. Ruthie sat on a cot, examining Omar's infected hand wound, listening without looking up. Angela Park spoke first. "I think a committee is reasonable." David Park nodded. Curtis, who rarely spoke, said nothing but moved his head in a gesture that could have been agreement. Nadia and Omar, through David's translation, indicated support. Ruthie said, "Fine by me." Aaron looked at me. "I'll support a rationing committee," I said. "Elected by the group, 3 members. And the committee reports to—" Leonard let the question hang. "The committee manages rationing. Other decisions remain with existing protocols." "Existing protocols established by you." "Established by me in the absence of any other structure. If the group wants to revisit the broader governance question, we can discuss that separately. I'd like to discuss it now. This meeting was called to address resource sustainability. Governance is a separate matter. I used procedure to defer the challenge. This is what I was trained to do. To separate issues, control scope, manage the sequence of decisions so that each one occurs in the context most favorable to orderly resolution. It is the core skill of a trial judge. It is also, I'm now aware, the core skill of someone avoiding a question she suspects she'll lose. Leonard accepted the deferral with a patience that worried me more than resistance would have. A man who accepts a delay is a man who believes time is on his side. The committee was elected that evening. Sandra received every vote. Leonard received 14 of 15. The third seat went to Marcus Bell, who received 9 votes without having spoken during the meeting, without having campaigned, and without acknowledging the result when Thomas announced it. Marcus Bell, the man I had sentenced, the man who had opened the hatch, the man who had brought 11 strangers into a shelter I claimed authority over, now sat on the only democratically constituted body in the facility. I recorded the vote on the legal pad. I wrote the numbers carefully. I did not write what I was thinking, which was that the shelter had just produced its first institution that did not depend on me, and that it had done so in 5 days, and that above ground, the same process had taken me 4 months. On day 8, a man named Dale Worthy tried to kill Curtis. It happened at the water distribution point, the pressure door threshold where Sandra dispensed daily rations from the collection containers Marcus maintained. Curtis had been assigned a standard adult allocation. Dale Worthy, who had arrived with the second group Marcus brought in on day 6. 4 more survivors, raising our total to 22, believed Curtis was receiving a double share because Sandra had handed him a second cup to bring to Nadia, who was running a fever in the bunk room. Dale did not raise the issue verbally. He swung a length of pipe he'd detached from an exposed conduit and struck Curtis across the back of the skull. Curtis collapsed. Sandra dropped the water container. Erin drew her sidearm. Dale stood with the pipe and said, "He's been taking double since he got here. Everyone knows it." No one had known it because it wasn't true. Ruthie attended to Curtis, who was conscious but bleeding from a laceration that would require the last of the sterile suture material. Erin disarmed Dale without resistance. He surrendered the pipe when the handgun appeared, which told me something about his violence. It was opportunistic, not principled. And now I had a criminal matter. Not a resource dispute, not a labor grievance, not a custody mediation. A man had committed aggravated assault with a weapon in front of witnesses. In the world above the hatch, this was a felony carrying up to 15 years in the state of Arkansas. In the world beneath the hatch, it was a problem that 22 people were looking at me to solve. I convened a hearing. I did this instinctively, the way a surgeon reaches for a scalpel, not because I decided it was the right tool, but because it was the tool my hand knew. I sat at the operations room table. Erin stood as bailiff. Tomas served as clerk, recording the proceedings on the legal pad. Dale Worthy sat in a chair facing me, his hands in his lap, his face carrying the particular defiance of a man who believes his grievance justified his method. "Do you deny striking Curtis?" I asked. "No." "Do you deny the weapon was a metal pipe?" "It was just a piece of conduit." "Do you deny that Curtis was receiving only his standard allocation?" "That's what she says." He pointed at Sandra. "But she's the one handing it out, so she'd say that." Sandra stepped forward. "I've logged every distribution since day 1. Thomas has copies. Curtis received exactly 1 adult ration per cycle, same as everyone. The second cup was for Nadia." "She's covering for him," Dale said. "I have documentation," Sandra said. "You have a list you made yourself. This is the moment I need you to understand, because this is the moment the shelter's legal architecture either held or collapsed. Dale Worthy was contesting the legitimacy of the records maintained by the Rationing Committee. The same committee the group had elected. The same committee whose authority derived from a vote Leonard Fisk had organized. If the committee's records were not credible, then the committee's authority was not credible. If the committee's authority was not credible, then the election that produced it was not credible. And if the election was not credible, then nothing I had built or approved was credible either. Legal systems are recursive. Every component validates every other component, and an attack on any single element threatens the whole. The committee's records are accepted as presumptively accurate, I said. If you have evidence of falsification, present it. My evidence is my eyes. I watched him get 2 cups. You watched him carry 2 cups. Sandra testified the second was for Nadia. Tomas, does the log support that? Thomas checked the ledger. Nadia's allocation was marked as delivered by proxy through Curtis at 1400, standard procedure for bedridden residents. Dale looked at the room. He was looking for allies. He found none willing to meet his gaze, not because they believed me over him. Some of them may have doubted Sandra's record, but because the process I was performing was familiar, and familiarity was, I understood now, 90% of what law had ever provided. I sentenced Dale Worthy to 48 hours of restricted movement. Confined to a cot in the storage room, meals delivered, no participation in water collection or shift rotation, not labor detail. I had learned something from Marcus Bell's sentence, though I couldn't have articulated it cleanly at the time. The trench crew sentence had been punitive labor designed to demonstrate communal consequences. What it had actually demonstrated was my willingness to assign disposability. Dale's sentence was spatial. You stay here, the community continues around you, and when you return to it, the incident is recorded but closed. Marcus observed the hearing from the back wall. He said nothing during the proceedings. He voted with the Rationing Committee afterward to confirm that the incident did not warrant altered distribution schedules. His only comment, delivered privately to Aaron as I recorded the judgment, was audible to me because the acoustics underground are merciless. She's getting better at this. I didn't know whether to receive that as encouragement or condescension, and I've decided it was both, and that Marcus Bell intended it to be both, and that the ambiguity was the most honest assessment of my performance anyone had offered. On day 10, Leonard Fisk held his governance meeting. I could not defer it again. The Rationing Committee had been functioning for 5 days. The assault hearing had established a judicial precedent. The shelter now contained 22 people organized around structures that I had initiated, but that were beginning to operate independently of my direction. Leonard's argument, which he presented with the measured competence of a man who had spent 30 years drafting county memoranda, was that the emergency basis for my unilateral authority had expired. You assumed command because no one else was available, he said. That was appropriate, but we now have elected representation, functional protocols, and a population large enough to sustain deliberative governance. I'm proposing a council, 5 members, elected, all decisions by majority, including judicial decisions. Judicial independence exists for a reason, I said. Judicial independence exists within a constitutional framework that no longer applies. The principle applies regardless of framework. The principle is that no single person should hold unchecked power. I agree with the principle. I'm proposing we implement it. The room divided. Not evenly, and not along the lines I expected. The Parks supported Leonard. David Park had been a school board member and instinctively trusted elected bodies. Ruthie supported me, citing the assault hearing as evidence that trained judgment produced better outcomes than group votes on criminal matters. Sandra abstained, which I felt as a defection even though abstention is not defection. Because Sandra's neutrality removed the rationing committee from my column, Marcus Bell voted for the council. He voted for it without discussion, without caveat, without looking at me. When Tomas counted the hands, 15 for, 4 against, 3 abstentions. Marcus's hand was among the 15, raised with the same quiet lack of ceremony he brought to everything. The council was constituted that evening. Leonard, Sandra, David Park, Ruthie, and a woman named Claire from the second group of arrivals who had said almost nothing in 5 days, but who received 7 votes on the strength of the fact that she'd been a paramedic. And people trusted medical competence as a proxy for general judgment. I was not on the council. I had not been nominated. No one proposed that the existing judicial function be represented. And I did not propose it myself, because self-nomination would have been the act of a person clinging to power. And I could not survive being seen that way. And the fact that I was calculating how I would be seen rather than what was right is the kind of honesty I promised at the beginning of this account. The council's first act was to confirm my judicial role, hearing disputes, adjudicating infractions, recommending sentences. Recommending, not imposing. The council would approve or modify sentences by majority vote. I had become an advisory judge. My gavel was decorative. I recorded this on the legal pad with the same careful handwriting I'd used for every entry. The letters did not shake. I made sure of that. On day 12, Marcus Bell adjudicated a dispute between Angela Park, Sari Ray, and Leonard Fisk over sleeping arrangements, and he did it better than I would have. The dispute itself was minor. Leonard had moved his documentation materials into the communications alcove, which Angela argued restricted access to the radio that Aaron monitored. Leonard countered that his census records required secure, dedicated space. Angela said the radio was a communal lifeline. Leonard said the records were the institutional memory of the shelter and deserved protection equal to any other critical system. They brought it to the council. The council discussed it for 20 minutes without resolution. Sandra proposed a compromise. Leonard rejected it. David Park sided with his wife. Ruthie sided with Leonard on the principle of document preservation. Claire said nothing. Marcus, who was not on the council but was present because everyone was always present underground, said, "Leonard, keep your papers in the storage room during sleep shifts. Use the alcove during waking hours only. Angela gets radio access on a posted schedule that doesn't conflict with Leonard's work hours." Both parties accepted immediately. The solution was elegant. It was also the exact structure I would have imposed if the dispute had reached my docket. Temporal division of shared space, formalized by schedule. Neither party's use negated. Marcus Bell had reached the same conclusion I would have reached, through a different mechanism. I would have arrived at it through precedent analysis and procedural framing. He arrived at it by listening to what both people actually needed and naming it aloud before anyone could build a position around it. This is the turning point, and I need to be precise about what turned. It was not that Marcus Bell was wiser than me. It was not that he was more just. It was that his judgment operated without the overhead of authority. He did not need to establish jurisdiction, cite principles, or locate his ruling within a procedural framework. He saw a problem, articulated a solution, and offered it in a register that invited acceptance rather than compliance. People agreed with Marcus because the answer was audibly correct. People complied with me because the structure demanded it. The difference between agreement and compliance is the difference between a system that sustains itself and a system that must be sustained. I had spent 4 months above ground and 12 days below it, sustaining a system. Marcus Bell had spent those same 12 days demonstrating what it looked like when the system was unnecessary. I did not experience this as humiliation. I'm being precise. It was closer to the sensation of watching someone perform a skill you possess, but with a technique so fundamentally different that your own version becomes not wrong, but visible in a way it wasn't before. I had always known I was performing law. I had believed the performance was the substance. Marcus Bell's effortless resolution showed me that the substance could exist without the performance, and that what I'd been protecting all along was not justice, but its costume. That evening, I sat with the legal pad and did not write. The fluorescent light hummed. Bea was singing to herself in the bunk room, a song about a frog that Sandra said she'd invented on day 30 of the outbreak and had been singing ever since. A 4-year-old's liturgy of continuation. Jerome sat beside his sister, silent, watching me through the doorway with the same unblinking attention he'd maintained since the courtroom. Jerome had not spoken in my presence. He had not spoken in anyone's presence. Sandra had noted in her mediation filing that his silence began on day 41. No one had told me what happened on day 41, and I had not asked because the mediation had been interrupted by the end of the world, and the question had seemed, in the hierarchy of crises, deferrable. I looked at Jerome. He looked at me. His gaze carried no accusation, no petition, no expectation. It carried observation. The pure, unsocialized attention of a child who had decided that watching was safer than speaking. I picked up the legal pad and wrote, Day 12. No incidents, no rulings, no proceedings. System functioning without judicial input. On day 16, the National Guard convoy reached the courthouse. We heard the vehicle's first diesel engines, multiple, approaching from the south. Aaron picked up their radio traffic on the VHF. A logistics element accompanied by a civil affairs team, moving through the county on a clearance and assessment mission. They had our coordinates from the earlier transmission. They were coming to extract us. Marcus went through the pressure door to make surface contact. He returned 40 minutes later with a staff sergeant named Reyes, no relation to Tomas, though they established this with a brief, exhausted exchange that functioned as the first humor I'd witnessed underground, who assessed the facility, counted heads, and told us the convoy could transport all 22 of us to a regional processing center 60 miles west. "Who's your leadership?" Reyes asked. Leonard stepped forward. "We have a 5-member elected council." "I need one name for the manifest." Leonard looked at me. The look was not generous. It was administrative. He needed a name that a military system would recognize as an authority, and a county judge outranked a county administrator on any institutional hierarchy the sergeant was likely to reference. "Judge Diane Okafor Watts," Leonard said. "Crittenden County District Court." Reyes wrote it down. He did not ask whether I was in charge. He did not ask about the council. He wrote the title because titles were legible to his system, and legibility was what extraction required. I was restored to nominal authority by a man who'd spent 11 days dismantling my actual authority, because the outside world still spoke a language in which my title had currency, and his did not. The irony was not lost on Leonard. He delivered my name with the flat efficiency of a man paying a debt in a currency he considers worthless, but that the creditor still accepts. We prepared to evacuate. Tomas gathered the records. His files, my legal pad, Leonard's census documents. Sandra packed the remaining rations into 2 duffel bags. Ruthie assembled a medical carry kit. Marcus checked the generator one final time and shut it down. The fluorescents died in sequence, returning the facility to the darkness we'd found on day 1. In the bunk room, as I gathered the wool blanket I'd slept under for 16 nights, Jerome Gaines walked up to me. He stood at my knee height and looked up with the same observational gaze he'd maintained since the courtroom. I expected nothing. I had learned to expect nothing from Jerome because expectations imposed a narrative on his silence that wasn't mine to write. He handed me a piece of paper, a page torn from the legal pad. One I hadn't noticed was missing. On it, in the careful printing of a child who was old enough to write but had chosen not to speak, were two sentences. "You let the man who stole the pear help us. That was the best thing you did." I read it twice. I folded it. I put it in my pocket beside the gavel. Jerome turned and walked back to Sandra. He did not look at me again. He did not need to. The statement was complete. It required no response, no ruling, no procedural acknowledgement. He had identified the single judicial act that mattered, not the sentencing of Marcus Bell, but the implicit vacatur that occurred when I allowed a convicted man to open a hatch, lead an evacuation, bring in strangers, and sit on a committee that superseded my court. The best thing I did was not a ruling I made. It was a ruling I failed to enforce. Jerome, who had watched everything and said nothing, had seen this before anyone else. I climbed the ladder last. Marcus held the hatch open above me. Daylight entered the shaft for the first time in 16 days, and the color of it was so alien after fluorescent white that my eyes interpreted it as pain before they interpreted it as sun. I emerged into a world I did not recognize. The courthouse above us was partially collapsed. The safe zone was gone. The barricade was debris scattered across 3 blocks. The convoy waited. Staff Sergeant Reyes processed us at the convoy staging point with standardized intake forms designed for a world that still assumed categorical clarity. Name, date of birth, prior occupation, medical conditions, skills, emergency contact, legal status. Legal status. The form meant, are you a civilian, a government employee, a military dependent, a foreign national? It was a classification question designed to route people into the correct processing stream at the regional center. Reyes handed one to each of us, and I watched 22 people fill in boxes that asked them to be what they were before the hatch. Marcus Bell wrote welder in the skills box. He left prior occupation blank. He left legal status blank. He handed the form to Reyes, who glanced at the gaps and said nothing because a form with empty boxes was still a form. And the system processed forms, not biographies. I filled mine out completely. Prior occupation, judge, county district court. Legal status, government, employee, state of Arkansas. Skills, legal analysis, dispute resolution, administrative procedure. I read what I'd written. Legal analysis, dispute resolution, administrative procedure. 3 ways of describing the same activity. Sitting in a room and telling people what to do based on rules that other people wrote in a context that no longer exists. I had listed my skills and produced a resume for a civilization that had contracted to the point where a welder who listened carefully was a more effective judicial instrument than a woman with a law degree and 14 years on the bench. The convoy moved at noon. We rode in the back of a covered transport truck. All 22 of us together, seated on bench seats, shoulder to shoulder. The engine noise made conversation difficult, which suited most of us. B slept. Jerome sat beside Sandra and watched the canvas flap at the truck's rear, where slices of the passing landscape appeared and disappeared. Burned structures, abandoned vehicles, a field where something had happened that I could reconstruct from the evidence, but chose not to. I sat across from Marcus Bell. He sat with his hands on his knees, his posture relaxed in the way of a man who had not needed to perform authority, and therefore did not need to rest from it. I realized I was exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. The fatigue was structural. 16 days of maintaining a system that progressively demonstrated it did not need me to maintain it, had depleted something that sleep could not restore. "Marcus," I said. The truck noise required me to raise my voice, which meant everyone heard. He looked at me. "Your sentence. The 14 days on the trench crew. I'm vacating it, formally, on the record." I held up the legal pad. Tomas, seated beside me, noted the date and the action. Marcus Bell looked at me for a long time. The truck bounced over broken road. Bea murmured in her sleep. "I appreciate that," he said. "You should know it was a bad sentence." "I know. The trench crew would have killed you. Probably. I assigned it because you didn't argue. I interpreted your silence as contempt. It wasn't contempt." "No. What was it?" Marcus considered the question with the unhurried attention he brought to every mechanical problem. Assessing the components, testing the connections, locating the point of failure. "It was patience," he said. "I was waiting to see whether you'd figure out what you were doing." "Did I?" He didn't answer immediately. The truck passed through a checkpoint. Voices outside, military. The canvas flap lifted and a flashlight beam swept the interior, counting heads, and moved on. "You're asking the wrong person," Marcus said finally. "Ask him." He pointed his chin toward Jerome, who was watching us with his unblinking, cataloging gaze. I looked at Jerome. Jerome looked at me. He reached into his jacket and touched the space where the torn page had been, confirming its absence, confirming it had been delivered, confirming the transaction was closed. I was the judge who sentenced the man who saved us. That's the record. The Regional Processing Center assigned me to their disputes desk on the second day. They needed someone to mediate allocation conflicts between intake groups. The work was familiar. The title was not. Community Liaison, Civilian Mediation. No bench, no gavel, no docket. A folding chair and a clipboard, and 2 people at a time sitting across from me, with grievances I could hear but not rule on. I keep the legal pad from the shelter in a waterproof bag under my cot. 16 days of entries in my handwriting, documenting the progressive irrelevance of my own authority. I keep the gavel in my pocket. I keep Jerome's note folded inside my credential holder, where my judicial ID used to sit. Some evenings I see Marcus crossing the compound, moving between the mechanical bay and the water treatment station, solving problems no one assigned him. He nods at me. I nod back. We do not discuss the shelter. We do not need to. I was trained to believe that law is what stands between people and chaos. Underground, I learned that law is what people build between themselves when they decide to stand. I was the last person in that shelter to understand this. A 7-year-old boy who hadn't spoken in 4 months understood it first.